The history of education from 1945 to 2000. In 1945, there is an emphasis on art as well as the sciences in the curriculum. Teachers and education weren't brought into the spotlight until Sputnik was launched by the Soviet Union in 1957. The reason that this brought teachers and education into the limelight was because of the space lag. The U.S. immediately blamed the education system for our space lag and said that the inadequacies in education were the reason the Soviet Union got to space first. The inadequacies in education in the United States had to do with too little math, science, and foreign languages in comparison to the education system in Europe. Education in the 1950s can be characterized as a war between the U.S. and Soviet Union school systems, each trying to educate the best scientists and engineers for development of military technology. The mindset that was set in the 1950s was that education is our first line of defense. The educational reforms that were attempted in order to bring math, science, and foreign language back to the top of the totem pole worked for a bit, but when it came to take the new strategies of teaching into the classroom, the strategies were unrealistic for the setting. So many teachers dismissed the new ideas and taught the way they always did. The War on Poverty in the 1960s. All the funding from Kennedy's administration went to the war on poverty and ultimately the education system, because the government believed that the key to breaking poverty from generation to generation was to get them educated. Many methods and programs came out of this attempt for victory on the war on poverty, such as Head Start and subsidized breakfast and lunch programs. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act was a part of Johnson's presidency. The act stated that funds would be allocated to districts based on their population numbers of children in poverty. This was done in order to give assistance to some of their problems. These problems included low achievement, poor discipline, and high teacher turnover rates. Equal opportunity in the 1970s. Desegregation started in 1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case. The Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case won under the argument that by segregating the schools, we were violating the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. Not only did this court case help end segregation by color, it also helped end segregation against women and children with a handicap. Equality and desegregation policies being put into place were not the only things to happen in the 1960s, but there were also huge declines in enrollment, test scores, and public confidence in education. Due to this decline, the public initiated a Back to Basics movement and called for teacher accountability. The Back to Basics movement called for standardized testing, strict codes of conduct, longer school days, and concentration on core subjects. A great debate in the 1980s. The 1980s focused solely on how to improve the quality of schools, and they did this through the educational reform movement. The education reforms of the 1980s resulted in some of the following improvements. More young people graduate now, more teachers have higher training, school buildings are better equipped, and instructional methods are more relevant and more diverse. The prominent philosophy in the 1980s was essentialism, which means that the teacher acted as the leader of the classroom, which also means that the teachers were rigid and disciplinary, and the role of the student is to listen and learn. They are to just trust that the teacher knows best. In the 1990s, in response to challenges such as greater diversity and less support for public education, innovative approaches to teaching and learning were developed throughout the United States. Time to recap. Sputnik and the United States feeling behind is the reason education got brought into the spotlight in the 1950s. In the 1960s, the war on poverty is what brought programs such as Head Start. The 1970s brought desegregation and equal education. The schools were reformed in the 1980s with stronger high school curriculum and a self-esteem focus in middle school. And teachers stepped up in the 1990s with new ways to lead the classrooms.